This guy, Flash Thompson, he probably deserved what happened. But just because you can beat him up doesn't give you the right to. Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. I've been having the dark thoughts lately. And I was just thinking, what if we've already read all the best, superhero stories that could ever be told? A lot of these characters have been around for 80 years, 60 years, and have been almost a continuous print since they were introduced, especially a lot of the big mainstays, which I'm going to get into some of the details of, obviously, here in this video. So you've had, some of the greatest writers of all time, and there's always so many places you can take these characters without absolutely breaking them. And it does feel like a lot of creators are willing to break the characters. But I think if you go and you break a character, you're automatically disqualifying yourself from writing a great story. You're no longer writing a Spider-Man story if he no longer believes in great responsibility. You know what I mean? With great power comes great responsibility. If he kind of gives up on it, becomes self-absorbed, you could do that every once in a while as like a deconstruction. But he has to realize he made a mistake, build himself up better. And then you have a more resolved Peter Parker at the end. Or if you have Batman shoot somebody with a gun, now you're not writing a Batman story anymore. You're writing Elseworlds. You're writing a whole new character. You're writing something for yourself rather than, something for the character. So there are really only so many places that you could take these characters. You're going to take them into space, maybe do a sci-fi story, or we got to take them as dark and gritty as humanly possible for what the character is while keeping the core components. Obviously an origin story. We get a lot of origin stories retold with a lot of the different characters. We also get a lot of heroes being beaten. You know what I mean? You don't see heroes losing a whole lot, but it's like that ultimate loss where it really feels like they may never return. Can sometimes be part of deconstruction, or like the tragic loss, lose the love of your life type of thing. You can only do so many of those stories with each character before it becomes redundant. And I think that's one of the reasons a lot of the stories we read nowadays do feel quite redundant. Every once in a while, people do something original. Even when they do original, you're still going to do something. It's still going to be kind of compared to what's come before it. So I'm going to talk about, a couple of street level heroes from DC Marvel, a couple of more superpowered heroes from DC Marvel, and what I think is the classic team book within all comic books. We'll talk about X-Men. So starting with the street level heroes, you think about Batman, the flagship comic, not only for DC Comics, but the entire industry. Been in print, in multiple titles for like 80 years. And there's been so many great, Batman comic book stories, and the evolution of the character is enormous, as you can imagine, with so many decades of people taking their own interpretation or spin on who Batman is or what makes a great Batman story. Recently, I would say the last Batman story that really stands out is potentially, something that you might put in like the top 10, top 15 Batman stories of all time is likely Scott Snyder's Court of Owls. Batman has the best rogues gallery probably in fiction, not just in comic books. We're talking a crazy who's who array of rogues. Everyone knows who the Batman rogues are. They all have their own symbols. You throw a symbol up there, you're going to know which character they're talking about. And to be able to introduce something like the Court of Owls, you obviously had to twist a little bit of history, and you get a cool character like Talon, and tie it into some history with some of the characters. And it feels really great, and it absolutely did at the time. And there's a reason that people talk about Scott Snyder's Court of Owls to this day. But does it really, stack up there with some of the greatest Batman stories of all time? You think about like the classic detective story for Batman, in my opinion, that's The Long Halloween, Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. That thing is fantastic. It's told in such a cool manner where it's going through the holidays as we're visiting essentially a year. And it's really the origin story of Two-Face as we have the relationship of Harvey Dent, Gordon, and Batman, as they're kind of the triumvirate watching over Gotham, and how it kind of breaks down in the end. As obviously Harvey Dent succumbs to a tragic event and kind of loses his mind. As we've also got the serial killer that they are at their wits' end trying to actually apprehend. So you have that wonderful classic detective story, The Long Halloween. There's been others in there, but it's really going to be hard to beat a story like that if you come on to Batman, if you want to do something that really cements your place in the Batman legacy. As far as like Batman being beaten, you're not going to beat Nightfall. Even if you told a cooler story, Nightfall already existed. It felt like, like a baseball bat to the head when you saw, like, oh my goodness, you could feel the impact of Bane finally breaking Batman in half. If you have another wonderful origin story of a villain, a new creation in Bane, much like the kind of Court of Owls, where you had something different, never really seen that character before. Obviously, I just talked to Chuck Dixon on the channel at the end of last week, where he said that was his oh shit character. When Bane arrives, something bad's about to happen, because you finally have a character that can not only match Batman's physicality, but he overmatches his physicality. As far as origin stories, there have been so many origin stories for Batman, but they always feel like less than. Even Scott Snyder, who I just talked about, his Court of Owls, does year zero come anywhere close to year one from Frank Miller? No. That is, Batman Year One, in my opinion, is the best Batman story ever told. A lot of people would disagree with me, but I think I got that one right on the money. Like they continuously revisit this era of Batman, but you're never going to be able to exceed it, because Year One is always going to exist no matter what. The same thing with like trying to go dark and gritty. You can go darker and grittier than The Dark Knight Returns, but you'll never be able to recreate that visceral feel when people read that for the first time and couldn't believe someone would take the character that far, or take the universe that far, or make Gotham that dirty and disgusting and that just menacing. This obstacle for Batman to overcome in The Dark Knight Returns. So you come on a character like Batman, you're talking about a daunting, a murderer's row of creators and stories that you're inevitably gonna be compared to. I personally think that the Black Mirror is phenomenally dark and disgusting, and obviously in there it's not Bruce Wayne as Batman, it's Dick Grayson. And I think a lot of times creators try to do that. Well, I'll just replace whoever the hero is in the mantle, and that they'll have their own top 10 list. It doesn't work like that. If you go and make Jace Fox Batman, he doesn't get his own list. He still gets compared to Year One, Nightfall, The Dark Knight Returns, The Long Halloween. And it's really hard for a character to overcome something like that. So I think it's really a disservice to a lot of these new characters that are being introduced with the same mantles that have already been established. Like Daredevil, obviously blind Batman from Marvel, real street level hero. Obviously he does have, I don't know, I don't think he really has superhero abilities, but people will say, because I don't think he's really superpowered, but people say he's a soda. Maybe that's a superpower. I don't think he's superpowered. He's more ground level character. You look at Chip Zdarsky's current run, I think it's fantastic, but it's already been done better. We've already seen Matt Murdock taken to his lowest level once again by Frank Miller. You're not going to exceed that. You're not going to beat Born Again as a dark and gritty take on what happens to Matt Murdock when the worst thing should happen and he's brought to his lowest level. It has to rediscover the hero that he truly is and rise above that. It's just and Chip Zdarsky's run's great. I think you could take that run, the meat of it, and you could make a Daredevil season 4, put it on Disney Plus, obviously because it's not going to be on Netflix. And I think it would feel like a natural progression of the character, and people would enjoy it in that medium. If they hadn't read Born Again, it probably would feel absolutely amazing. But as a comic book reader, Born Again already exists. So Chip Zdarsky's doing something fantastic, but it can never be the best. because these things are already out there. What do you think about like the juxtaposed hero? When you have the Daredevil versus Punisher fight, obviously that was a fantastic season 2 of Daredevil on Netflix. When it really highlights who Daredevil is and the differences between Daredevil and Punisher, and that maybe he has in my opinion, a higher value moral code. So people would disagree. I imagine a lot of Punisher fans would disagree with me. But it's going to be hard to ever recreate or top that. Same thing with like the tragic loss of Elektra in Last Hand. That's a big moment. That's a huge loss. Obviously, she's come back because it's comic books. And then as far as origin stories, we have seen the origin of Matt Murdock. It's almost like the Batman of Marvel Comics, where every time anyone comes on, they remind you that his dad was a boxer, was dirty, and he got he saved somebody, got hit in the eye with some chemicals and became blind, and that's how he became a hero. But you're not going to beat the Man Without Fear at this point. Even if you told a story that was equal to it as far as quality, structure, and execution, Man Without Fear is already there. You're not going to be able to beat it. As we go over to kind of more, the superhero realm, obviously Superman was the flagship character for all of comics for a long time. Now superseded by Batman, but 80 years of history on Superman. Recently, we had that Peter J. Tomasi run where we did see, well, it wasn't completely new take because Superman has had a child before, but the introduction of John Kent really changed the fabric and the dynamic of what Superman was. And I think Peter J. Tomasi's run is fantastic. But it could never be number one. Because even if you look at the classic interpretation of the hero, Superman for all seasons exists. All-Star Superman exists. Now, there have been a ton of new origin stories for Superman. I say Man and Superman from Marv Wolfman a couple of years ago, that 100-page giant, is a fantastic origin story. And I think if they expanded upon it, perhaps it would have had a fighting chance to overcome Man of Steel, fight John Byrne. But Man of Steel is still there. That really changed the character. You think about that. It's like 40 years ago now, 34 years ago, that they had these massive changes. And you're always going to be compared to Man of Steel. Even Superman, the Blue Boy Scout himself, has had that dark and gritty story, Red Sun, Mark Miller. That's a crazy interpretation of Superman. What happens if he doesn't land in Smallville with the kids? What if he lands in Soviet Russia? As a communist. My goodness. That is a wild take on it. You go like, well, I like Injustice. It ain't Red Sun. We already saw that version. Yeah, he goes farther in Injustice, but Red Sun's still there. You can't overcome that stuff. And there's been so many classic Superman stories. I personally say, in my opinion, Up, and Away, by Kurt Busiek and Jeff Johns, is the best Superman story I've read. And I think a lot of people, if they read that, would somewhat agree with me. But even that one, that story is just highlighting that Clark Kent himself is the actual hero. That's a bit of a different spin on that. But after that, it's going to be hard for you to take Clark Kent himself as a character and really outshine a story like that. It's crazy the amount of fantastic stories we have these characters. You go to Spider-Man, the flagship character from Marvel Comics. Really, it's such an important character to the fabric of comic books. Just really changed everything. If you wanted a teenage superhero in comic books before that, they had to be a sidekick. Peter Parker didn't have the perfect, personal life. I wouldn't say he was a loser, but maybe he was a little bit of a loser. You know what I'm saying? It was a new interpretation of the character, really groundbreaking. Nick Spencer's run, which just ended, I think is thought of very favorably, especially in comparison to Dan Slott's run, which preceded it for like 8 years. But it pales in comparison to almost everything that was out there that preceded, even though it's still good. Nick Spencer was behind the 8 ball when they gave him the Spider-Man writing gig, and it wasn't because he just had the absolute debacle that was Secret Empire. is because he was writing Spider-Man. Are you ever going to have a better interpretation of what a classic superhero is than the master plan, where you have probably the most iconic, wonderful image in comic book history of Peter Parker, Spider-Man, basically with a building collapsed on him, willing himself, to get out of the rubble, even though he knows he's defeated. It's like, it gets no better than that. When you take on the role of the Spider-Man writer, you are being measured against that on day one. It's a losing proposition. You're never going to win. And, is there a better tragic loss story than the night Gwen Stacy died? My goodness. Bring a little tear to your eye. You're just thinking about what happened there. It's just so sudden. And then in the end, there's no words. It's just Spider-Man holding Gwen, as he's mourning the loss, and you see him lose it. Peter never loses it. He's always in control. That's why he doesn't beat villains to death. He kind of toys with it. He kind of loses it there. And obviously, you get the death of Green Goblin after that. Spider-Man is one of the few characters that got the origin right on day one. You're never going to beat that Ditko Stan Lee origin, no matter how many times they try. And then you even have a dark and gritty version of Spider-Man. It's not really a Spider-Man story, in my opinion, but Kraven's Last Hunt is really dark. Go look at the iconography associated with that story. You're not even going to write a better horror comic, starring Spider-Man than Kraven's Last Hunt. You're lost before you even started when you started with a lot of these characters. And you think about the X-Men, in my opinion, the premier team book, Hickman's House of X Powers of 10, was probably the most exciting comic book event thing that happened, in my opinion, in the last 5 years in comic books. People came in that had left the comic book hobby behind to go read those comics. But even that, you think, House of X Powers of 10, obviously you got some sci-fi elements into it. You have some time displacements where you're changing things, alternate timelines and whatnot. How are you going to beat Days of Future Past? 2 issues. The story stands up and was converted into a mega successful movie. That's how much Claremont and Byrne put into that story. Or a new apocalyptic future, which we certainly got elements of that in House of X Powers of 10. Did it beat Age of Apocalypse? I don't think so. As far as, the sci-fi elements, is it better than the Dark Phoenix saga? No, it's not. Hickman is a great writer. He's done some great things. House of X Powers of 10, I think, as far as his Marvel work, is his apex. It's his greatest work. And it's still, because it's being measured against the Dark Phoenix, Days of Future Past, Age of Apocalypse, and even Giant Size X-Men. Because, you have Krakoa, that's where you have the introduction of the island or whatever. And it ends up falling short. Now, does that mean you're never going to read a great comic story again? No, of course. The Chip Zdarsky run on Daredevil is great. It's going on right now. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it can never be the best because of the amount of history. And I'm going to take this idea and I'm going to go further with it and perhaps upset you guys with it with Doc tomorrow. This is just me talking about what a bad place these writers are in. Now, there are opportunities where you could write the best story in the history of comics for that character or whatever. You think of like Robert Menditti's Hawkman. I personally think that's the best run that you're going to get on Hawkman, and the first 12 issues are the best story that you're ever going to get on, or that have ever been told on Hawkman. And I've read quite a bit of it. But Hawkman isn't a widely used character. He doesn't show up all that often. He gets a miniseries here and there, very rarely gets an ongoing. So you have history. You got something to work with, and you got something to compete with. Hell, you're even competing with Jeff Johns himself, the greatest modern writer in DC Comics history. But at least it's manageable. At least you can become the best. But the problem is, DC Comics will never tell you the fucking comics exist. Did they ever tell anybody that Hawkman by Robert Venditti was even out, or that it was the best damn comic book they were publishing at the time? Because that character, because it's not Batman, it's not Superman, and if it was in Marvel, it's not Daredevil or Spider-Man or X-Men. It's deemed unimportant. So you could have the best story ever, or the best run ever for a character, and it ends up falling by the wayside because the character is deemed insignificant or unimportant, in comparison to all these other things that are going on. Another problem, I think, another place that you can work as a sweet spot and really do some things that are groundbreaking, cool, and really stand out as doing something that stands the test of time, or in these Elseworlds kind of stories. The problem is DC keeps taking their Elseworld stuff and integrating into the real stuff. Or even their animated stuff. They're mixing in their animated characters in with the real world, where they were kind of standalone at one point. So you have something like modern. I'll go with Sean Gordon Murphy's Batman White Knight. As long as that thing never touches the actual DC continuity, it has a fighting chance of being something special, being something that elevates itself. Not, yes, it is associated with Batman, but it's a completely different take on Batman. It has some core elements, but it kind of throws some things on its head and goes a different direction with it. And certainly does incorporate, obviously animated universe stuff into it. So I think that's like one of the opportunities, if you're a creator nowadays, where you could really, make your mark, make a legacy, where you're not having to compete with Frank Miller's Batman and Daredevil, or Steve Ditko and Stan Lee's Spider-Man, or John Byrne's Superman. Is these kind of self-contained worlds. I think, I'm not the biggest fan of Tom Taylor right now, but if you go read his Deceased, that's a cool little universe. I think it sucks that they aren't making anything in it anymore, because I think they had the perfect setup to really do some cool things down the line. But I think that's the sweet spot where you'll be able to see some creators really establish that legacy and not have to be compared to some of these great stories where you have 80 years of incontinuity Batman that you're competing with, or 80 years of incontinuity Superman that you're competing with, or 60 years of incontinuity Spider-Man. How many? We've had upwards of 4 or 5 Spider-Man comics going on at the same time. So there's a lot of history and a lot of great stories to compete with. But here's the bad news: there's a good chance, as far as incontinuity Batman, you've already read the best story that will be told. Same thing with Spider-Man, Daredevil, and these other big characters like Superman, X-Men. But the cool thing is, if you can go and find that cool character that's outside of the main, characters that have been publishing constantly for decades upon decades, you can find something like a Robert Venditti's Hawkman that really stands out. And when you read it, you can appreciate it and realize you are reading the best version of the character that's ever been presented. You are reading the best story about this character that's ever been published. It's just you got to go outside and find some of those characters that they don't play with quite as much. But then you have to be frustrated when your run ends that they might not do anything with the character for another 5 or 10 years. So got to take with the good with the bad. I'm not, hey. I don't know. What do you guys think? Was I too crazy on that one? Did I go too far? You're going to love the conversation I have with Doc tomorrow, where I say that Spider-Man, Batman, and Superman ruined the comic industry.